If you read about tanks online, you've probably seen your share of fake ones. I'm talking about things like the E79, the KV6, the Panther that doesn't burst into flames when you look at it funny. These are, of course, entirely fictional. There's probably 100 videos out there talking about how they don't really exist, and I don't need to make another one. However, I did want to talk about some other fictional tanks. These tanks weren't made up after the war, they were actually made up during the war, either as a result of miscommunication, bad intelligence, poor memory, or some other kind of mishap. Uh, Sometimes there's actually a kernel of truth behind the fiction, and these fictional tanks can have a pretty strong effect, despite never existing in the first place. So let's start with a pretty famous trio. These were German tanks that were spotted by British intelligence by December of 1940. They were called rather uncreatively the Type 5, 6, and 7. At that point, there really wasn't much known about them aside from their names, but by the end of January, the British also found out their weight and their armament. The first tank, the Type 5, was going to weigh 36 tons. It had one 75mm gun and four machine guns. Now, this tank is, I mean, it's kind of mundane. The Germans already had a tank called Panzer IV. It was heavier than the Panzer III, and it really wasn't much of a leap of logic to say that they're going to have a tank called Panzer V, or Type 5 as the British called it, that is going to have a bit more armor, a bit more weight to it. Four machine guns seems strange, but not particularly interesting. The tank that came after that, the Type 6, however, was a bit more different. This tank also had a 75mm gun, but it weighed 45 tons. So clearly some kind of significant improvement was made to this tank in order to justify all of the extra weight. Like the Type 5, it had four machine guns. The biggest threat in the list was the Type 7. This was a 90-ton tank which had a 105mm gun, two auxiliary 47mm guns, and also four machine guns. So you could probably write this off as a faulty source or some wires getting crossed somewhere in a foreign intelligence office, if not for the Red Army discovering the exact same thing. Red Army intelligence had a slightly different version of events. Their Type 5 weighed between 32 and 36 tons and had, instead of four machine guns, just two or three. The Red Army also discovered the armor thickness of the Type 5, which was going to be between 30 and 60 millimeters. In the Red Army's version of the Type 6, the tank had a 105mm gun, although a 75mm gun was still an option. Auxiliary armament included either one 47mm gun or one 20mm gun and three machine guns. This tank had between 45 and 75mm of armor. The Red Army's version of the Type 7 was also the heaviest of the three at 90 tons with 50 to 90 millimeters of armor. Strangely enough, the first version of this report didn't link the 105mm gun to the Type 7, only to 47mm guns or to 20mm guns. But in later reports, the Red Army came to the same conclusion, that this 90-ton heavy tank was going to use a 105mm gun. So this is where the Red Army was in trouble. The gun that they expected this tank to have was the 105mm Flak 39, which was an anti-aircraft gun that was even more powerful than the 88mm one that the Germans were quite fond of. This gun was powerful enough to defeat any tank the Soviets had on the drawing board, including the T-150, which was kind of just an upgraded version of the KV-1 with some quality of life improvements, and the T-220, which was a significant upgrade, including mounting a 85mm gun. Both of these tanks were, if not obsolete, then no longer sufficiently future-proof, and this triggered a whole revamp of the Soviet heavy tank program in the KV-3, KV-4, and KV-5. I'm not going to go too deep into this new heavy tank program. That's probably best saved for another video. But suffice it to say, the Soviets took the announcement of new German super heavy tanks quite seriously. In March of 1941, the British confirmed pretty much the same information that the Soviets had, uh, including the armament and armor of these new German heavy tanks. It was also theorized that one of these heavy tanks was going to carry an what they called 8 centimeter AA gun. the British do figure out that this is the 88mm Flak 36. The British also found out the size of these tanks, and the Type 5, 6, and 7 were truly going to be monstrous. The Type 7, for example, was 14 meters long and had a crew of 24 men. Despite being confronted with these monsters, I couldn't really find any reaction that the British had. The most I could find was the development of a tank destroyer on the chassis of the Churchill tank, but that does not really seem sufficient to fight a 90-ton super heavy tank with a 105mm gun. So, multiple sources seem to corroborate the development of the Type 5, 6, and 7, but we know that no such tanks ever existed. However, if you squint a little bit and kind of connect the dots, you can see where this information came from. For example, the Type 5 is a 36-ton tank with a 75mm gun. Well, that looks awfully close to the VK3601 that, in fact, was in pretty far along in development by March of 1941. The Armour is not right, so the VK3601 actually had 80mm in the front and 60 on the sides, but they got it a little bit wrong. The weight is also a bit of an understatement. By that point, it weighed closer to 40 tons than 32, but you get some wrong, you get some right. This is not a terrible guess as far as intelligence goes. The Type 6, weighing 45 tons, one might say that, oh, that's a dead ringer for the VK4501, which is the prototype of the Tiger tank. However, that's a bit of a maybe more difficult connection to make. While the VK3601 was indeed in development in March of 1941, the VK4501, as far as I can tell, really takes shape by May. So British and Soviet intelligence, whatever they saw in a 45-ton German tank, that really wasn't it. The Armour is nowhere close. 75 millimeters was close to the requirement of 80mm front armor for German assault tanks, but the side armor is nowhere close, and the armament really doesn't align. So I think this one is more fiction than fact. The 90-ton Type 7 seems like the most outlandish one, but actually it is also quite a bit of a kernel of truth to it. The Germans were working on a tank called the Artilleriewagen, which was a 80 to 100-ton assault tank with 100 millimeters of front armor, so the estimate of 90 millimeters was not that far off, and a 105mm gun. However, this was not the 105mm Flak 39. This was a much shorter. It was going to be either a 20 caliber or a 28 caliber version, just for shooting high explosive rounds to demolish fortifications. This was not a tank destroyer. It was more of a close support gun. Of course, it didn't have a crew of 24 men, and it didn't have two auxiliary 47mm guns, so all of that was incorrect. But as you can see, there is a little bit of a kernel of truth even to this fictional tank. Sometimes information coming in about tanks is ultimately correct, but it's fragmented. For example, in September of 1944, the American military mission warned the Red Army about two new German heavy tanks. One of them was called the Tiger II, which was a combination of the Tiger and Panther tanks, and the other one was called the Tiger Imperial, which was a 68-ton heavy tank. Today, we of course can tell that both of these tanks are actually the same tank, the King Tiger or Royal Tiger, and I suppose Imperial Tiger isn't that much of a stretch, but at the time there was absolutely no way to tell that this was one tank and not two different ones. Another such doubling of real tanks happened in 1944 to 1945 in a variety of British sources, through prisoner interrogations or contacts in neutral countries. The British assembled a veritable bestiary of German heavy tanks ranging from 75 to 180 tons. This collection included such gems as the Adolf Hitler Panzer, which had two 88mm guns, one fixed in the hull and one in a rotating turret, and the Eisener Ferdinand with a 220mm gun and two auxiliary 75mm guns. None of these tanks, of course, existed. There were also in that collection about a half dozen tanks, either called Maus or Mäuschen. One of them, which I'm going to lump in with the Maus tank, was a tank called Mammut or Mammoth, which was described by a German engineer. However, it was a small problem. That engineer, he wasn't a tank engineer. He was a civil engineer. He never worked on tanks in his life. His actual job was to build a kind of a concrete swimming pool for the Maus to perform trials in. He didn't actually know much about the tank other than it was going to weigh about 200 tons. However, even though he wasn't a particularly reliable source, this information was still included in intelligence summaries, and even today in some sources you can see the name Mammut associated with Maus prototypes, but that name was never actually used by the Germans. It only came from this one engineer who was commenting on probably an unsubstantiated rumor he heard. These issues, of course, were by no means exclusive to Allied intelligence, and the Germans collected their own selection of super heavy mythical tanks around the same time that the Soviets were reporting that the Germans were producing a 90-ton super heavy tank. The Germans themselves were reporting that the Soviets were producing a 115-ton heavy tank in Chelyabinsk. In 1942, German intelligence reported that a super heavy tank called Zarodino was being used against Army Group Center. This was a 150-ton tank, which featured one 152mm cannon and one 75mm cannon. Of course, no such tank ever existed. It was probably a mix of information about the KV-1 and the KV-2 that somehow merged into a single tank. One of my favorite tanks developed by German intelligence this way was a series, not just one, but a whole series of super heavy tanks with either 2, 3, or 5 turrets. They had up to 200mm of armor and interesting armament like an 86mm gun, a 96mm gun, or a Katyusha battery on top of their actual main turret. There were even drawings made showing how these tanks might look like, but of course, these tanks were never seen in real life because they never existed. The appearance of phantom tanks didn't end with the end of the Second World War, and the Cold War birthed their own share of these mythical vehicles. For example, the CIA reported that the USSR was using a so-called turtle tank. The turtle tank wasn't a new thing. It was already used against Germany in 1943 on the Volkhov front, and it was quite an interesting device with a German 88mm L56 gun, the same one is used in the Tiger, an American-made gasoline engine, crew of 5, which is kind of reasonable, and up to 80mm of armor. The Americans understood that such a tank might no longer be competitive, and theorized that it could have been upgraded with a longer 88mm gun, such as the one from the King Tiger, and a more powerful 800 HP engine. This wasn't the only tank in the Soviet arsenal with American roots. The CIA likewise theorized that the Soviets were using an upgraded Sherman tank that weighed a whole 45 tons and had a crew of 7 men to operate its primary armament, which was a 76.5mm gun, and secondary armament, which included 4 machine guns. Even the intelligence report does say that a crew of 7 men seems quite excessive, even for a tank with 4 machine guns. Based on the other parts of the description, this really just feels like a M4A2 HVSS Sherman. I don't know where they got to it being 45 tons in weight. Compared to these monsters, reports of such tanks as an Su-122 with 2 122mm howitzers side by side, and a IS-9 tank with a 152mm gun. I mean, these tanks seem completely mundane by comparison. It's easy for us these days to say that, well, of course, these were fake tanks. They never existed and they could never exist. But with the fog of war, you can never really be sure. As you can see, even a tank corroborator in multiple sources can be fake, and a tank that appears somewhere once and seems completely unbelievable can still turn out to be quite real.